All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're going to wrap up our discussion on Chapter 4 in organic chemistry by really talking about what makes these carbon skeletons really do something in living things. And that comes down to these things called functional groups. So functional groups are specific configurations of atoms that are commonly attached to those carbon skeletons. And it's more often than not these functional groups that give these organic molecules their properties, and also is typically what ends up being involved in the chemical reactions from making one molecule into something else. So these functional groups will pull off a hydrogen off of one of those bonds to carbon, and then replace it with this functional group. So each group is going to behave consistently too from one molecule to the next, which is really kind of helpful from a person studying organic chemistry, because if I know a molecule is behaving this way or that way, I know what the group is, and reverse is also true. If I go and look at the chemical structure and I know that a particular group is present, I know how it's going to react. The number and arrangement of these molecules ultimately is what gives those big organic molecules their properties. And the other nice thing is, remember that hydrocarbons overall are hydrophobic, and yet they're very prevalent in the watery environment that is life. So how do we manage to do that? Well, these functional groups are all hydrophilic, so they end up increasing the solubility of these organic compounds in these watery environments that life lives in, which is also super beneficial. So there are going to be 7 particular functional groups that are very important to biochemistry. They're not all of them that exist in organic chemistry, but since we are specifically focusing on the biochemistry side of things, these are the ones that you should be familiar with. So let's kind of step through, take a look at their structure, so that you can identify them, and then also what are some of their big properties, so you can start knowing those as well. Side note here, might not be the worst thing to make some flashcards for these. It's going to be really helpful if you aren't good at identifying these yet, to become more proficient in that, and also knowing their properties as well will also help benefit you as we continue to move forward and talk about these molecules this year. So let's start with the hydroxyl groups. So these are highly prevalent in your alcohols. So if you ever see an OL at the end of a compound, you're probably talking about an alcohol, and we probably have one of these hydroxyl groups present, which is just an OH group. And this is going to act very similar to water in the sense that, at least at this end of the molecule, we've got some polarity going on. That oxygen is going to hang on to that hydrogen's electron a little more. And so you are going to get some of those partial charges as a result. So it is capable of forming hydrogen bonds with water, which once again helps it to dissolve better in a watery environment. So something like ethanol would be an example, 2-carbon molecule with that OH on the end, and you can see eth being the prefix for 2 carbons, and then the OL at the end of the name for that alcohol. So our next functional group is the carbonyl group, and this is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. Now, depending on where we find this functional group within the carbon chain, the names of the compounds and the properties are a little bit different. When we find that carbon double bond oxygen somewhere in the middle of the chain, so something like acetone here, then we talk about these as ketones. And when we look at them as a terminal carbon, or what we consider the last carbon on the chain, in either situation, we talk about them as aldehydes, so something like propanol here. Both aldehydes and ketones are very commonly found in sugars. So ketoses are ketone-containing sugars, aldoses are aldehyde-containing sugars. Carboxyl groups are basically kind of taking that carbonyl group and slapping a hydroxyl group on top of it. So we get a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, and then that carbon is also bonded to an OH group. So we talk about these guys as carboxylic acids or organic acids because they are frequently acidic in a solution because they will lose that H from that OH group and become ionized in solution. So more often than not, when we find these in cells, they end up with that -1 charge. And we talk about them as carboxylate ions because they're losing that H plus to solution, so increasing the acidity of their environment. Amino groups, or amines, actually are sort of the opposite then. They are very often bases in solutions. So we end up seeing that they will actually take up an H plus from solution. They are more stable in that +1 configuration by adding that extra H plus. And so as a base, they're removing H pluses from solution, lowering that H plus concentration as a result. Allowing for a more basic or more alkaline environment when they are found. Sulfohydryl groups, or a sulfur plus a hydrogen, these are thiols, so these guys become really important when we start talking protein structure because they'll often do what we call cross-linking, where two sulfohydryl groups will actually covalently bond to each other. And that really helps to stabilize internal protein structure. So we get a lot of that particular piece of cross-linking happening between those proteins. Phosphate groups, hopefully you've probably come across these when you've talked about things like ATP or DNA structure, the phosphate groups in the backbones. We talk about them definingly as organic phosphates, and they will very much be seen as a 2 negative or 1 negative in solution because they end up losing H pluses here, and so they end up with these negative charges on those oxygen molecules in that group. They definitely have the potential to interact with water, and so that also becomes a big role in their ability to help molecules who contain these to increase their solubility. And then methyl groups, these are going to come back when we talk about gene expression later this year, because these methylated compounds containing these CH3 groups play a role in the way that DNA actually bonds to itself, condenses, uncondenses in that chromosome form, and that's going to affect the access to that genetic information and the way that your cells are actually able to have access to those genes, and as a result, whether or not they're capable of expressing that information. We also see arrangements of methyl groups in male and female sex hormones, and that also ends up affecting their shape and their function as well. So definitely stay tuned. These methyl groups are going to come back as we talk about more stuff this year. And the last thing I just want to leave you with is just this idea of ATP. This one's definitely going to come back a lot. It is technically a modified nucleotide, so hopefully you know what that means. When we talk nucleotides, it's the basic structure for nucleic acids, which gives you your sugar, your base, and then typically when we talk about nucleotides, it's a single phosphate group. The reason we call this a modified nucleotide is because it's got 3 of those phosphate groups. So we talk about them sort of getting shoved together like loading springs in a ping pong game, where we're really compressing that spring, and as a result, there's a lot of potential energy, a lot of chemical energy stored in those bonds between those phosphate groups. And so when we break those phosphate groups off, we end up with an excess amount of energy release, and then your cells are able to take that excess energy release and go use that excess energy to do other types of cellular work. So we're going to talk a lot about ATP this year, so I just wanted to bring it up since it came up in this chapter. And then when we go and talk about metabolism, how do we recreate that ATP is going to come up in terms of things like photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So stay tuned. This one's definitely coming back a lot too. So make sure you know the basics. ATP standing for adenosine triphosphate, and those phosphate groups, breaking them off allows the energy to be released for cellular work.